Hey guys, tonight we're stepping back in time to a single moment when a breath that was never taken changed the course of a nation forever. On a bone-chilling morning in February of the year 1511, King Henry VIII, the most powerful man in England, held his newborn son, Prince Edward VI, a boy who was supposed to be the future of the entire kingdom. But in just 52 days, that future vanished, leaving behind a grief that would transform a golden king into a tyrant and plunge his kingdom into an era of bloodshed and chaos. This isn't just the story of a forgotten prince's life. It's the story of how his death became the first tragic note in a symphony of destruction, leading to severed ties with the church, executed queens, and the rise of a dynasty stained with fear. We're going to uncover the forgotten details of this small life and its colossal impact. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there in the comments below. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. On a bitterly cold February morning in 1511, the most powerful man in Europe stood beside a small cradle, his breath misting in the frosty air. Henry VIII gently lifted his fragile son into his arms and felt, with each shallow exhalation, that hope itself was slipping away. The infant, Prince Henry Tudor, the newly bestowed Duke of Cornwall, had lived for just 52 days, and now, as the boy's faint heartbeat waned, a grim certainty settled over the king's heart. This was more than a private sorrow, it was the first domino in a cascade of tragedies that would rend England's social fabric, shatter its religious unity, and forge a reign of ruthless ambition that would echo through centuries. Only a few weeks before that bleak dawn, on New Year's Day of 1511, joy had reigned supreme. Catherine of Aragon had given birth to a robust baby boy, the first male heir in a generation. Bells had pealed thunderously across London, their sound carrying for miles over snow-dusted rooftops. Bonfires had roared atop every high point, casting amber light against the dark winter sky, and the air had smelled richly of roasting boar and spiced ale. Commoners and courtiers alike had thronged the palace gates, their voices rising in cheers at the proclamation, "A prince is born!" Oh, Henry, radiant and confident at just 19 years of age, had seized that moment to cast aside memories of civil war and timid rule. Mounted on a snow-white destrier, clad in shining armour that gleamed like frozen flame in torchlight, he had entered the lists at Westminster. Lances shattered in the echoing hall, and every strike seemed a declaration. This dynasty is secure. Pages had raced through gilded corridors, bearing silver platters heaped with live songbirds when the birds were freed. Their wings had stirred laughter as they scattered into the rafters. Fountains of wine had flowed freely, and the scent of lavender and rosemary had mingled with the smoke of torches and the tang of roasting flesh. By dawn, the revelry had spilled into the streets. Makeshift tourneys had sprung up along the Thames embankment, and communal tables groaned under the weight of bread, cheese, and steaming porridge sweetened with honey. Choirs had gathered in every church, their voices straining through Latin hymns until the morning sun chased away the stars. For those few precious days, England dared to believe that the fragile promise of a male heir would banish forever the spectre of dynastic collapse. Yet even amid this exhilaration, faint warnings had begun to stir. Courtiers had exchanged uneasy glances as they noted the baby's soft cough and the way he shivered despite layers of silk and wool. At night, his cries had sounded thin, his cheeks ashen rather than rosy. In the royal nursery, a retinue of wet nurses and physicians conducted round-the-clock vigils. Astrologers pored over star charts by candlelight, proclaiming favourable alignments, while priests muttered prayers of exorcism to ward off evil spirits. The physicians, steeped in the humoral theories of the age, had bled the prince in hopes of cleansing his tainted blood. They ground pearls into powder for ointments and prescribed draughts of honey-sweetened wine imbued with mysterious spices. Incense smoke curled through the air in thick coils, and sprigs of rosemary and sage lay entwined among the baby's silken wraps, believed to drive away miasmas. Yet the remedies, however grand, proved no match for the savage grip of winter and the limitations of Tudor medicine. Catherine, pale and anxious, could scarcely bear to look upon her son's tiny form. She hovered by the cradle, her delicate hands trembling as she whispered lullabies in her native Spanish. Each day her eyes grew more hollow, her voice more desperate, as she watched life ebb away in those feeble chest-rising motions. Still, Henry insisted that the tournaments continue. He would not allow the kingdom to pause its celebration, for to do so would be to admit weakness. In his eyes, any hint of faltering resolve threatened not only the life of his son, but the stability of the realm itself. And so, the revels pressed on, a stark contrast to the silent grief gathering in the hidden corners of Richmond Palace. While the lords and ladies danced and feasted, the heir to the Tudor throne slipped further from vitality. Each cough grew more laboured, each breath shallower, until in that final, fragile moment, the cradle was left empty. The future of England reduced to a memory of what might have been. In the hush that followed, even the bells of London seemed reluctant to break the morning's solemn stillness. The domino had fallen, and with it began the unravelling of an age. In the first weeks of 1511, the royal nursery at Richmond Palace became a place of hushed vigilance and ritual. Wet nurses washed their hands in brandy before every contact, donning gowns of purest white to symbolize both purity and protection. Candles burned day and night, their flames kept alive even in draughts, believed to ward away malevolent spirits. Sprigs of rosemary and sage were woven into the tiny swaddling cloths and tucked beneath the mattress, placed there to counteract miasmas thought to lurk in every draughty corner. Rumours of plague haunting the city streets only heightened the court's anxiety, so much so that only the most essential attendants were permitted near the prince's cradle. Even close relatives were barred entry, unless they submitted to the same stringent purification rites. Court astrologers, poring over parchment charts by dim candlelight, muttered of unfavourable alignments. They pointed to a cluster of sinister stars low on the horizon, ominous portents for a child both precious and precarious. Their voices, though meant to guide, only added weight to the sombre atmosphere, as if each whispered prediction applied invisible chains to the stoutest heart. In the corridors beyond, courtiers exchanged wary glances, their usual gaiety drained away like ink in water. The boy who embodied England's hopes now lay in sweet-smelling linens, a silent testament to the fragile promise of the Tudor line. As fever and cough took hold, the royal physicians enacted Tudor medicine's most drastic measures. They bled the infant, drawing off warm blood into silver bowls, convinced this would purge his body of built-up malefic humours. Pearl powder was pounded into a fine paste and smeared over his delicate limbs, while honey mixed with aromatic herbs was forced between his lips in hopes of soothing the fever's burn. Thyme smoke filled the room, swirling among the pillars of the canopy, intended to cleanse the air of unseen poisons. Yet these ministrations, though grand in their ceremony, seemed to sap the prince's scant vitality rather than restore it. Queen Catherine, once radiant with maternal pride, grew pale and hollow-eyed. She spent long hours leaning over the cradle, her slender fingers smoothing the linen and tracing the faint outlines of her son's tiny hands. Her voice, when she spoke, was a soft Spanish lullaby, carried on a trembling exhalation. She wept in secret corners, her tears glistening on the folds of her gown, and offered fervent prayers at every chapel along the palace grounds. But as her strength waned, her smile became a thin, forced curve and echo of its former warmth. Meanwhile, Henry VIII withdrew further into his role as sovereign warrior, retreating to the tournament grounds, as if to prove that royal authority remained unbroken, even as his own heart threatened to splinter. That winter was particularly merciless. Bitter gusts howled through the high windows, snuffing out candles and sending servants stumbling in the gloom. The echo of their shivering breath mingled with the distant clatter of cartwheels on cobbled streets where plague's spectre lurked unseen. Inside the palace walls, the medicine records grew longer, each bleeding stroke, each poultice application meticulously noted in gilt-edged folios. Charms and amulets were hung above the infant's crib, tokens of faith in relics and miracles. Endless masses were said. Priests in scarlet cassocks chanted prayers for deliverance. Yet all their fervour and ceremony could not halt the inexorable decline of that fragile life. By the beginning of February, the situation had become painfully clear to even the most hopeful attendants. Nurses, their faces drawn and tear-stained, moved like silent shades through the nursery. Physicians replaced blood-soaked linens with heavy sighs, the pungent scent of moxa and herbs clinging to every surface. Catherine could no longer bear solid food. She knelt for hours upon cold stone, her rosary beads worn smooth by ceaseless fingers. Henry, though racked with grief, did not afford himself the luxury of outward sorrow. He stood at banquet tables, mask of regal composure in place, issuing commands for the tailoring of new gowns and robes to drape the prince for a grand ceremony he dared not abandon. He clung to this final act of provision as if it could stave off the darkness, gathering in his son's fragile chest. On the eve before the inevitable, the queen remained by the cradle all through the night. She rocked her son gently, her hair loose and unbound, whispering his name like a benediction. The soft strains of her voice, like a distant lullaby, drifted through the rooms in hushed reverence. Henry stood behind her, silent and still, his broad frame motionless, as though he feared to disturb the fragile breath that flickered like a dying candle. He did not shed a tear. Instead, he watched with a somber detachment, as if steeling himself for the crushing blow he already sensed had become unstoppable. When morning came on the 23rd of February, the hush that fell over London was like a shroud. The final, faint rise and fall of the child's chest ceased, and with that cessation, the realm held its collective breath. News spread swiftly. Servants paused in their tasks. Vendors in the market lowered their heads, and even the hulking towers of the Tower of London seemed to mutter in quiet accord. The chiming bells fell silent, as though mourning their own inability to toll for so small a life. On that sombre morning, England's grand pageantry was irrevocably eclipsed by a grief so deep that it would reshape the kingdom's future in ways none could yet comprehend. On the day the young prince slipped away, London awoke to a pall of sorrow that settled over its streets like a shroud. At first, there were only murmurs, soft, uncertain whispers drifting through the dawn chill. But as news spread from door to door, those furtive tones swelled into cries of lamentation that pierced the still air. Passers-by clutched their cloaks tighter against the wind, their breaths visible as puffs of despair, each one mourning a child who had not yet learned to smile. Along the Thames, bargemen paused in their tasks, heads bowed, oars resting mid-stroke. Market stalls stood half-empty, as vendors exchanged solemn glances rather than loud greetings. Even the cobblestones themselves seemed to hold their breath in that heavy mourning. Within the palace walls, symbols of hope were dismantled in a grim ritual. Gowns of purest white, once worn by the nurses, were replaced with deep black robes, folded and locked away. Tiny rattles and carved wooden horses, tokens of a future he would never know, were sealed in chests destined for some forgotten storeroom. The ivory cradle, elaborately carved and draped in silken banners, was disassembled piece by piece, its ornate canopy taken down in silence. Catherine, Queen of England and Aragon, could not bear to leave the royal apartments. She knelt for hours before a gilded statue of Christ, her palms pressed together, lips moving in a prayerful murmur that carried through the hush like a soft wind. Her complexion, once full and rosy, had turned parchment pale. Her eyes, swollen from weeping, reflected a grief so profound it seemed to still the very walls. Henry VIII maintained a facade of stoic composure, every inch the monarch unbroken by personal loss. Yet his gaze often strayed to the empty cradle. His shoulders slumped beneath the weight of a crown that suddenly felt heavier than ever before. He walked the long galleries with deliberate steps, his black cloak trailing behind him like a shadow of his sorrow. When courtiers approached, he returned their bows with a rigid nod, betraying none of the upheaval within. But in his eyes, those steel-grey windows there, lay a distant, almost hollow look, as if the king's spirit had gone wandering somewhere far beyond the palace gates. The funeral was arranged at Westminster Abbey, with all the solemn grandeur befitting a royal heir, yet it bore the stark emptiness of a life cut tragically short. The coffin, a small chest of white oak, was edged with gleaming bands of gold, each bar polished to a mirror finish. 4 noblemen, draped in sable mantles, bore it through the arched doorway into the vast nave. Their footsteps echoed across the cold stone floor, accompanied by the deep toll of the abbey bells, each peal a lament for the prince who had not drawn his first breath. Candles lined the high altar, their flames guttering and dripping wax onto the flagstones, leaving pools of molten light that glowed like embers in the gloom. A choir of monks in ebony habits chanted requiem masses, their voices rising in solemn cadences that filled the cavernous space. The notes of the Latin hymn, In Paradisum, drifted through the arches, each syllable carrying the promise of peace beyond mortal suffering. Henry and Catherine walked behind the coffin, separated by a respectful distance, like two sovereign figures performing a duty rather than grieving parents. Their hands did not touch. Their faces were composed, yet in the dim candlelight, observers saw tears glisten on Catherine's cheek and a tremor in Henry's lower lip. When the coffin was lowered into its burial vault beneath the abbey floor, Catherine let out a single, broken sob, a sound so fragile it seemed to fracture the silence. Henry turned away abruptly, his gait swift, leaving the congregation in stunned stillness. Courtiers and clergy alike stood motionless for a heartbeat longer, uncertain whether to follow him or linger in mourning. At last, a hush fell, deeper than any before, as if the abbey itself bowed its head in respect. The void left by the absent heir threw the question of succession into stark relief. Whispers rippled through the court. Could the Tudor dynasty endure without its promised scion? Eyes darted anxiously at one another, memories of the Wars of the Roses resurfacing like bitter ghosts. Nobles exchanged worried glances, fearful that rival houses might seize the moment to press their own claims. Foreign ambassadors, normally bound by diplomatic courtesy, allowed subtle smiles to flicker when they thought no one was watching. They saw in England's grief an opportunity, a chance for their sovereigns to gain advantage in trade negotiations or military alliances once the chaos unfolded. Catherine's family in Spain sent condolences wrapped in careful counsel. Their letters spoke of comfort and sympathy, yet hinted that the king should consider alternative paths if he wished to secure his line. Even as they mourned, they reminded him of the necessity of a male successor, for without one, the crown could slip from the Tudors' grasp. Henry received each missive in silence, his expression unreadable, and then, as if determined to stave off panic, he summoned his advisers to the White Hall. There, before a gathering of dukes, earls, and prelates, he declared that England would not tremble before fate. His voice, though measured, carried an undercurrent of steely resolve. He spoke of rebuilding hope, of seeking divine favour anew, but his words rang hollow to those who had witnessed the empty cradle. Behind his regal poise, the monarch's confidence quavered, for he now understood the fragility of a throne founded upon the health of a single child. In the days that followed, Henry's demeanour grew increasingly irritable. He found fault with ministers over the most trivial matters, his royal temper flaring at slightest perceived slights. Catherine, once his cherished companion, bore the brunt of his frustration. He questioned her about prospects for another pregnancy, with a sharpness that stung like winter's chill. Her every movement was weighed for signs of fertility or failure. Meanwhile, the papal legates stationed in London felt the mounting pressure from an impatient king. Henry's messages to Rome, previously respectful and deferential, now carried a tone of impatience tinged with veiled threats. The court's ambivalence toward papal authority, long simmering beneath the surface, began to flare visibly. These events marked the genesis of seismic shifts in England's religious and political landscape. The king's demand for a male heir and his growing frustration with papal reluctance would, in time, cleave the kingdom apart. But for now, it was enough to witness a monarch caught between devotion and despair, his gaze alternately lifting to heaven and flickering toward the empty space where his son's cradle once stood. In that tension between loss and ambition, faith and fury, England found itself on the brink of transformations that would alter its course irrevocably. After the funeral, Henry VIII appeared, tempered and weighed down by a sorrow that seemed to age him by years in a matter of days. The youthful exuberance that had once driven him to tilt in grand tournaments and to host festivals of unparalleled splendour was replaced by a brooding stillness. He spent long hours pacing the corridors of the nursery wing, pausing often before the empty cradle that once held his son. In those moments, his gaze would linger on the carved posts and the silken canopy, as if expecting a tiny fist to grip the polished wood. His once bright eyes, which had shone with the thrill of victory and the flush of romantic conquests, now reflected a haunted void. At court, the subtle shifts in the king's temperament became impossible to ignore. Where he had once greeted courtiers with jovial banter, he now answered inquiries with clipped, even petulant remarks. He began asking probing questions about Catherine's health, his tone laced with suspicion rather than concern. Every word the Queen spoke was weighed and passed, as though she herself bore responsibility for the death of their firstborn. In private audiences, Henry would lean forward, eyebrows drawn tight, and demand precise details of Catherine's daily routine, her diet, and any hint of discomfort she might have experienced. The Queen, accustomed to deference and praise as the symbol of the Anglo-Spanish alliance, found herself reduced to a figure under scrutiny, her dignity preserved only by the stiff grace with which she held her head upright. Elsewhere in the palace, ministers and nobles murmured among themselves. Some recalled the king's earlier generosity and magnanimity. Others remembered how swiftly he could turn that same resolve to harsh judgment. Now he issued edicts with an uncharacteristic severity. A lord who brought news of Spain's reluctance to fund Henry's proposed campaigns found himself stripped of office. A bishop who hesitated to grant new taxes in the name of succession was accused of disloyalty and faced a private, chilling reprimand. Whispers spread that no report, however factual or well-intentioned, was safe if it angered the king, especially if it concerned the Queen's ability to bear another son. For Queen Catherine, the transformation of her husband was a trial of unimaginable weight. Once celebrated for her piety and her role as consort, she now navigated a world where each misstep might be seen as evidence of her failing fertility. Yet, she persevered in her duties, greeting ambassadors with regal poise, attending daily masses with unwavering devotion, and dispensing alms with the same gracious hand she had always offered. Her smile, once warm and confident, had become a rare and fragile thing, like a candle flame flickering in a windless sanctuary. Still, she held her place in the court, determined that her conduct remained beyond reproach, even as the king's distrust shadowed every interaction. It was against this backdrop of personal grief and suspicion that Henry VIII began to question the very foundations of his kingdom's faith. He chafed at the delays of the Roman Curia, which hesitated to approve his request for new subsidies to support both his military ventures and the uncertain continuity of his dynasty. He sent missives laced with veiled threats. If the Holy See did not expedite its counsel, he would consider alternative measures regarding the vast wealth of England's monasteries. Rumours then arose among the populace that the king, in his desperation, might declare himself sole arbiter of royal marriages, severing the sacramental bonds that only the Pope could formally dissolve. Haunted by the necessity of securing a male heir, Henry turned to legal scholars and jurists, commissioning treatises to assert that the monarch, and not the pontiff, held supreme authority over ecclesiastical matters within the realm. Learned men were convened in clandestine gatherings, poring over canon law and precedents from antiquity, seeking every argument that could elevate the king above foreign spiritual jurisdiction. This quiet campaign of reasoned disputation would later be known as the King's Great Matter, the grand undertaking that set the stage for England's eventual break with Rome. Yet Henry's outward show remained that of the triumphant sovereign. In the tilt-yard, tournaments continued at regular intervals, the clang of lances and the cheers of the crowd ringing as loudly as ever. Festivities, jousts, feasts, and mask performances were staged with opulent daring, designed to broadcast the invincibility of the Tudor crown. The splendid revelry masked a kingdom, trembling on the precipice of doctrinal revolution. Beneath the gilded surface, the council chambers simmered with dissent. Some bishops privately despaired that the king's preoccupation with matters of succession would lead to irreparable rupture with the universal church. Meanwhile, ordinary Londoners watched the shifting tides with apprehension. Tavern-goers spoke in hushed tones of their suspicion that the king's grief had soured into anger, an anger aimed not only at the papacy, but at any who questioned royal prerogative. On street corners, barbers and cobblers speculated whether monasteries might soon fall to royal decree, their lands redistributed to favoured courtiers. A sense of unease gripped the city. The familiar rhythms of faith and governance seemed about to fracture, and no one could say what would replace them. Amid the pageantry and intrigue, the Queen's silent suffering served as a reminder of what lay at the heart of these grand designs. Henry, once renowned for his charisma and chivalry, had become a man consumed by the spectre of his lost son. The empty cradle in the nursery was his constant tormentor, and each passing day without an heir tightened the grip of his despair. His search for legal justification to annul past bonds and redefine royal authority was driven by that singular, obsessive desire to ensure that no future morning's dawn would ever bring the same devastating emptiness. And so, as tournaments resounded with trumpets and banners snapped in the wind, a quieter drama unfolded behind the curtains of state. The king's personal anguish had sparked a transformation of crown and country, one that would ultimately tear England from centuries of tradition and cast it into an unprecedented age of religious and political autonomy. Yet in those hours of twilight revelry, few could have guessed how far Henry's grief would carry him, or how profoundly it would reshape the destiny of a realm. When Henry VIII began to distance himself from Catherine, his gaze drifted toward the younger ladies of the court, each vying for a chance at royal favour. Among them, one foreign girl caught his eye more than the rest. Anne Boleyn, a spirited maiden with dark, luminous eyes and a wit to match her beauty. At first, Anne's courteous refusals only drew the king closer. He found in her coy laughter and subtle glances a promise of novelty, and hope not merely for companionship, but for the possibility of a son to succeed him. In the delicate balance between affection and authority, Anne sensed an opportunity and moved with quiet grace. She offered Henry whispered assurances of a future brighter than any before, of dynasties secured and a realm at peace beneath their son's rule. Driven by longing and despair, Henry resolved to sever the bonds that held him to Catherine. He proclaimed that their union, though lawful, had been against heaven's design, for it failed to produce a male heir to bear the Tudor name. When Pope Clement VII refused to annul the marriage, Henry did not falter. He declared himself the supreme protector of spiritual matters in England, usurping the very mantle that Rome had worn for centuries. With that bold assertion, he launched a campaign to silence his critics, dissolve monasteries, and appropriate their vast wealth. In ornate letters and missives dispatched across Christendom, he outlined new legal mechanisms to strip the Pope of authority within the realm, paving the way for a schism that would echo through the ages. This was no mere personal grievance, but a cataclysmic turning point in history. The Church of England was born of Henry's will, its head no longer the Bishop of Rome, but the King himself. Those who clung to the old faith regardless of their rank found themselves labelled traitors. Sir Thomas More, once Henry's trusted chancellor, was imprisoned in the Tower of London for refusing to swear the oath of supremacy, a solemn pledge of loyalty to the new ecclesiastical order. Others fared no better. Bishops and abbots were stripped of their titles and lands, scholars were silenced, and whispers of dissent were quashed in the dark corridors of power. Catherine, displaced by the annulment, was cast into grand but lonely isolation. Stripped of her regal offices and her Spanish retinue, she spent her days in seclusion, a queen in exile within her own palace walls. In her place, Anne Boleyn was elevated to the status of queen, crowned in Elizabeth's grand cathedral with pomp and ceremony befitting a sovereign. But even as the crown pressed down upon Anne's brow, hope still dangled just beyond reach. When her first child was born, the court held its breath only to witness the arrival of a daughter, christened Elizabeth, whose very name hinted at a lineage torn between two mothers. Henry's heart, once aflame with promise, flickered with frustration anew. The cycle of anticipation and disappointment began again. Each milestone weighed heavily against the collateral of dynastic expectation. Across the kingdom, the ripples of Henry's reforms tore through centuries-old traditions. Monasteries that had stood for generations fell silent, as their stones were repurposed into fortresses or grand homes for the king's loyal courtiers. The scriptoriums where monks had copied ancient texts were shuttered, their libraries broken apart in the name of royal supremacy. The common folk, long accustomed to the charitable workings of the religious orders, suddenly found themselves with no sanctuary or succour. Markets slowed, and tavern talk turned to fearful speculation. What would become of the lost souls who once depended on the church's beguiled generosity? Under the weight of grief for his firstborn, Henry wielded religious power like a weapon. He imposed new taxes under the banner of divine right, and he declared that any who resisted the dissolution of the monasteries were enemies of both God and crown. In every decree, in every sermon authorized by royal mandate, he drove home the message that the stability of the realm depended upon securing a legitimate male heir. He surrounded himself with jurists who drafted laws as if he were a conquering emperor rather than a mourning father. His anger, kindled by the memory of his lost son, transformed into an unyielding will to dominate. The king's voice, once known for its warmth and laughter, now cut through the halls with chilling authority. Yet even as Henry pressed on, the kingdom quivered on the brink of upheaval. Noble families, once secure in their holdings, now feared revocation of lands if they showed sympathy for the old faith. Scholars at the universities whispered cautions against elevating temporal power above spiritual wisdom, and all the while the people endured, their faith shifting like sand beneath a tide they did not fully understand. They worked the fields once tilled by monks, they prayed in parish churches newly under royal patronage, and they whispered bedtime prayers for the soul of the infant prince who had never known laughter. In the quiet moments between the clamour of courtly pageants and legal manoeuvring, one heard the echo of a simple truth. That power, no matter how absolute, is built upon the lives of the vulnerable. Henry's relentless pursuit of an heir reshaped the very foundation of English society, imprinting upon its stones the memory of a father's grief and a king's resolve. The dissolution of convent walls, the crowning of a new queen, and the forging of an autonomous church all sprung from the same source: a father's unquenched sorrow for a son lost too soon. As the last vestiges of papal authority gave way to the Tudor crown, Anne Boleyn stood at Henry's side, her slender hand clasping his, her future bound to the exigencies of dynastic ambition. Yet the same ambition that raised her to royal favour also carried the seeds of her own undoing. For in a world where the need for a male heir overrode every other bond, no alliance, be it of love or law, could claim immunity from the king's inexorable will. And thus, in the hush that followed each royal decree, the kingdom held its breath, wondering if Elizabeth might one day rule not merely as a daughter of kings, but as a testament to a promise that began in sorrow and was sustained by the iron resolve of a grieving father. After Anne Boleyn was crowned queen, Henry VIII pressed forward with reforms that would reshape the very soul of England. The first decisive step came at the Convocation of London, where English bishops, under the king's mandate, declared him to be the supreme head of the Church of England rather than the Pope in Rome. In that solemn assembly, mitred prelates in their ornate vestments bowed to Henry's will, their voices echoing off ancient stone walls as they proclaimed his spiritual authority over every parish and pulpit. This bold pronouncement paved the way for the Act of Supremacy in 1534, a law that enshrined the monarch's absolute power not only in matters of state but also in matters of faith. With the stroke of a quill, monasteries across the realm, great abbeys and humble priories alike, were dissolved. Their lands and treasures were seized by the crown, and their inmates, once devoted cloistered souls, were turned out into the world. The familiar sight of monks chanting in candlelit chapels vanished, replaced by the clang of iron gates closing behind fleeing novices. Libraries of ancient manuscripts were dispersed or destroyed, and the charitable functions once sustained by these orders, education, hospitals, relief for the poor, were abruptly left to the uncertain mercy of local magistrates. For the common people, the dissolution was a shock that reverberated through every village and town. Fields tilled by monastic labour lay fallow, and the routes of pilgrimage, once thronged with devout travellers, fell silent and overgrown. Though Anne had ascended to the throne with such promise, she produced only one child, a daughter named Elizabeth. The court's initial celebrations yielded to a hush of disappointment when another princess, rather than the hoped-for prince, arrived. Henry, torn between his affection for his daughter and the urgency of securing a male heir, could not conceal his frustration. He compared Elizabeth to Mary, his firstborn, with Catherine of Aragon, as though each princess embodied the kingdom's unfulfilled potential. The fragile equilibrium between hope and despair tipped again toward dread. Meanwhile, those stalwarts of the old faith who refused to acknowledge the king's supremacy found themselves in peril. Sir Thomas More, once Lord Chancellor and a man revered for his integrity, was branded a traitor. Bishop John Fisher of Rochester met the same fate, condemned for speaking against the Act of Supremacy. Both were beheaded on Tower Hill, their executions sending a chill through the highest ranks of church and state. Their martyrdom served as a stark warning. To challenge the king's religious authority was to invite death. The break with Rome ignited fierce divisions within the nobility and clergy. Many lords, whose fortunes had long been tied to monastic endowments, suddenly lost vast swathes of land. Faced with the loss of income and influence, they had little choice but to adapt or revolt. In the north, a groundswell of anger gave rise to the Pilgrimage of Grace, a massive uprising of peasants and gentry, demanding the restoration of Catholic worship and the return of monastic lands. Yet Henry's response was merciless. His generals marched north, quelling dissent with swift punishments. Leaders of the revolt were executed, and banners of the old faith were trampled beneath the hooves of royal cavalry. As Anne's failure to bear a son became increasingly glaring, Henry's favour turned like the seasons. He sought pretexts, whispers of adultery, allegations of treason to justify removing her from power. In the stillness of the Tower, Anne and several of her closest supporters were subjected to hasty trials. Accused of consorting with enemies of the crown, they were condemned to death. On a grey morning, the Queen's gilded hair was shorn, and her regal gowns replaced with sombre linen. With head bowed, she ascended the scaffold, her final prayer a murmur of resignation. Anne Boleyn's demise stood as a chilling testament to the king's unrelenting pursuit of an heir. When she ceased to serve that purpose, she was discarded without mercy. At the same time, Henry flaunted his might through grand construction and martial display. He ordered the expansion of Hampton Court, its red brick wings stretching like arms to embrace the River Thames. Whitehall Palace was built anew, its halls and chambers designed to showcase royal magnificence. Abroad, he launched military campaigns against France, draping banners of crimson and gold across the battlefields. At home, court chroniclers waxed lyrical in lavish accounts of architecture and warfare, declaring that no expense had been spared. Yet beneath the triumphal arches and successive jousts lay the bones of monasteries recently razed, the memory of silent cloisters erased to send a clear message. The king's authority, temporal and spiritual, would brook no rival. Every stone laid in the new palaces bore silent witness to the dissolution of England's ancient spiritual foundations. Each festival, with its gaiety and wine, served to mask the unease that rippled through the population. In taverns and alehouses, whispers spread of uncertain futures of the poor deprived of monastic alms, of scholars mourning the loss of libraries, of entire villages struggling for sustenance. Yet when subjects gathered in the streets to witness Henry's pageants, they applauded if only to avoid suspicion, even as their hearts ached for a stability that seemed to slip further away with each passing day. In the growing twilight of his reign, Henry remained driven by an obsession born of loss. The spectre of his firstborn son, Prince Henry Tudor, haunted his thoughts. With every act of reform, every architectural marvel, and every execution in the Tower's shadow, he sought to ensure that the empty cradle of his heir remained a spectre of vengeance more than sorrow. For in Henry's mind, the consolidation of power, the transformation of religion, and the creation of a national church were not abstractions. They were the king's desperate answer to a personal tragedy that had set England on a path of irrevocable change. In that legacy of iron and blood, the old faith found itself supplanted by a new order, one in which a single monarch could bend heaven and earth to his will, if only to prevent the emptiness of a cradle from ever darkening his door again. After the tragic fall of Anne Boleyn, Henry VIII found solace in a more gentle companion, Jane Seymour. Their marriage, solemnized in May of 1536, seemed ordained by Providence when, in the autumn of 1537, Queen Jane gave birth to a longed-for son, Prince Edward. The court rejoiced at last. Trumpets blared through the corridors of Hampton Court, and bonfires flickered in the crisp night air, casting dancing shadows upon the stone walls. Yet that joy proved as fragile as the candle flames lighting the prince's nursery. Queen Jane's life, like that of so many before her, flickered out only days after childbirth. Though the infant Edward survived, his mother's passing cast a sombre shadow upon the royal household. In the years to come, Edward would ascend the throne as Edward VI, Edward VI, as some chroniclers spelled it. Yet his frailty served as a constant reminder that the spectre of premature death still stalked the Tudor line. In the hush that followed Jane's funeral, she was remembered not only as a queen, but as the Queen of Compassion, for she had died in the very act of securing the dynasty. Yet that title, embroidered in the royal records, did little to reassure subsequent consorts that motherhood might offer them any greater security. Catherine of Aragon's daughter Mary had been stripped of her princess title during the upheaval of the king's great matter, only to see it restored in the new order. Elizabeth, daughter of Anne Boleyn, had likewise been cast into limbo, before reclaiming her place in the line of succession. Thus, the king's three children, Mary, Elizabeth, and Edward, wore three different crowns of lineage, each carrying the blood of a different mother and the weight of a different promise. The court often whispered of the legitimate heir and the cursed queen, debating which child's claim was strongest, and whose very conception had been shadowed by the failures of previous unions. Amid these tangled claims, the Tudor court remained deeply divided between those who clung to the ancient rites of Catholicism and those who advocated for more radical reform. Edward Seymour, created Duke of Somerset, emerged as the young king's first protector and was soon followed by John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland, each vying for influence over the throne. Their rivalry shaped policies in rapid succession. Under Queen Jane's brief regency, the atmosphere had grown slightly more tolerant toward those of the old faith. But under Edward VI's nominal rule, the pendulum swung toward harsh enforcement against Catholics. Priests who dared celebrate the Mass in whispering chapels were imprisoned, while radical reformers among the King's Council pushed through injunctions that dismantled images and relics once venerated. When Mary ascended the throne, the policy reversed again, restoring Catholic ceremonies and punishing Protestant dissenters. This dizzying carousel of faith left many ordinary souls uncertain which ritual or which sovereign would guide their prayers at dawn. Young Prince Edward himself, ever the fragile heir, was raised under strict instruction in the classical texts of Rome and Greece, yet never permitted the comfort of old Catholic traditions. Each lesson in Virgil or Cicero, each debate on theology, carried with it the unspoken question, would this boy live to become a true king, or would he, like his elder siblings and his mother, succumb to the cruel whims of nature? Whenever Edward fell ill, as he often did, the court was plunged into anxious remembrance of the fateful 52 days that had claimed his brother. Physicians and apothecaries were summoned in haste, bleeding bowls and pearl dust poultices readied for nightly ministrations. Priests were instructed to say extra masses, and relics from distant shrines were paraded through the corridors in solemn procession. The intensity of these rites, performed in candlelit chapels, underscored the desperation that clung to every breath Edward drew. Meanwhile, Duke Somerset, wielding the regency's authority, seized each moment of Edward's minority to solidify his own power. He distributed lands and titles to those loyal to his cause, prompting murmurs of discontent among older nobles who felt their ancient offices slipping away. Rumours spread that England had become, in effect, a puppet state ruled not by the boy king's hand, but by Somerset's will. Such whispers painted the regency as a nascent tyranny, a state within a state, in which no decision could be made without fear of reprisal. The courtiers watched their every step, wary that a single misworded compliment might draw suspicion of disloyalty to the crown or to whatever faction held sway that afternoon. As tensions rose, the court's atmosphere grew oppressive. Catholic sympathizers spoke in hushed tones, fearing arrest and execution. Reforming clergy, though outwardly favored, wondered if their zeal for doctrinal purity might not one day be perceived as political threat. The very air in Whitehall and Hampton Court felt charged with unease. Tapestries and rich carpets that once cloaked the hallways in warmth now seemed to absorb every echoed murmur. In the dining halls, tables laden with roast and wine grew silent as lords and ladies glanced over their shoulders, each uncertain which religious law or royal decree might be swept away with the next breath of change. Through it all, Edward VI remained a poignant symbol of the Tudor paradox. A fragile boy king upon whom the weight of a nation rested, his health as unpredictable as the political tides. His tutors, strict and solemn, drilled him in scripture and statecraft in equal measure, preparing him for a reign that many feared might never truly begin. But should he survive to full manhood, he would inherit a kingdom forever altered by the upheavals of his father's ambition and his half-siblings' tragedies. For now, the relentless cycle of reform and reaction continued. Each policy shift a reminder that in the Tudor court, power and faith were entwined so tightly that to touch one was to tremble the other. And so, behind the gilded windows and beneath the vaulted ceilings, the young king's cough stirred fresh anxieties. With each fleeting cough, the ghosts of Prince Henry Tudor and Queen Jane Seymour returned to the nursery, urging new prayers, new rituals, new anxieties. As Duke Somerset marshalled the realm's resources for yet another campaign, this time to secure fortresses in Scotland or burnish England's naval strength, the spectre of dynastic failure hovered ever near. The shadow it cast stretched long, a reminder that the Tudor dream was as delicate as the breath of a sleeping child, and that the line of succession, once thought so secure, might yet vanish like the smoke from a monastery's smouldering pyre. When Edward VI passed away in 1553, The Tudor court seemed to shudder before collapsing into a fresh spiral of upheaval. Whispers crept through the hushed halls of Whitehall Palace that the young king's brief reign had ended as quietly as his frail life. Almost without pause, the crown descended upon the head of his half-sister, Mary Tudor, now Queen Mary I. In the soft glow of dawn, trumpets sounded her ascent, but the note they sounded was sombre, tinged with both relief and foreboding. Queen Mary moved swiftly to undo the religious revolution her predecessors had wrought. Within hours of her proclamation, proclamations in turn repealed the Act of Supremacy, restoring papal authority over the Church of England. Bishops who had once knelt before Henry VIII now bent their knees again to the Bishop of Rome, their cassocks rustling with cautious zeal. Every parish was ordered to resume the rites and rituals the reforms had cast aside. Vestments of crimson and gold were brought out of dusty chests, and richly embroidered altar cloths, once stripped away, were pressed back into service. In villages and towns, common folk heard the tolling of church bells once more beckoning them to confession, their hollow reverberations echoing through lanes that had grown silent for years. Yet restoration came at a grim price. Queen Mary, driven by a fierce devotion to the old faith and perhaps by sorrow for her mother's deposition, embarked on a campaign to root out heresy wherever it lingered. The list of condemned grew steadily longer. Clergy who preached reformist sermons were arrested, their books seized and burned before the crowds. Among the first to fall was Hugh Latimer, a venerable leader of the Protestant movement, whose impassioned voice had once stirred hearts in Cambridge and beyond. He and many others were marched to Smithfield, bound to pyres that awaited them beneath grey skies. As the flames took hold, the air filled with a scent of burning wood and singed robes, a harsh reminder that faith and authority now walked hand in hand with cruelty. In the pages of the court's journals, Mary was henceforth called Bloody Mary by those who feared her zeal. Letters from abroad carried news of the executions with both horror and a grim kind of envy, for some foreign diplomats saw in her severity proof that a ruler must enforce truth with iron will. Nonetheless, the common people, accustomed to the gentle ministrations of their former priests, found themselves torn between fear and sorrow. In cathedrals and chapels, they watched processions of monks and nuns restored to habit, yet trembled at the thought of an errant word of contrition that might land them beside a burning stake. While the kingdom burned its heretics, Queen Mary also sought to strengthen her alliances through marriage. In clandestine councils and candlelit audiences, she plotted to wed Philip of Spain, Philip II, as he would be known to restore the ancient union between England and the Habsburg Empire. Envoys arrived, bearing sumptuous gifts, strings of pearls the size of gourds, tapestries woven with the emperor's arms, and crates of fine Hispano, Moresque silk. The promise of such a match unsettled the populace, who spoke in worried murmurs of foreign bondage and the weight of Spanish ambition pressing upon English soil. Yet for all her pageantry and political manoeuvring, Mary's dreams of maternity remained unfulfilled. From the moment she ascended the throne, she undertook every ritual imaginable to secure a son. Prayers were said daily in the royal chapels. Relics of saints were paraded through the palace in solemn processions. Candles were lit and left to burn for days on end, their wax pooling in golden pools upon the stone floors. She knelt for hours before the image of the Virgin Mary, beseeching divine favour with tears that trailed down her cheeks like silent prayers. Herbs reputed to enhance fertility, yarrow, rue and vervain, were brewed into teas that the queen drank at dawn. Yet her womb remained stubbornly silent. As months stretched into years, the lack of an heir cast a pall over every courtly celebration. Festivities meant to honour harvests or saints' days were tinged with apprehension, for the court knew all too well the price of dynastic failure. Catherine of Aragon's daughter had once seen her own marriage annulled for failing to produce a son, and Anne Boleyn's daughter Elizabeth had lived through her mother's fall for similar reasons. Now Mary, who bore the memories of those tragedies in her heart, faced the same fear. Without a male successor, the Tudor line threatened to splinter once more, and the spectre of another civil war loomed like a distant storm on the horizon. Finally, in the autumn of 1558, Queen Mary's health gave way under the strain of her labours, both political and personal. She slipped into a fever that no physician's poultices could quell. In her last days, the Queen lay in state in the Red Room at Whitehall, surrounded by portraits of her predecessors, and the relics she had held so sacred. Candlelight flickered across her pale features as courtiers murmured prayers, each breath she drew seeming to echo the fragile breath once drawn by her infant brother so many decades before. When Mary expired on the 17th of November, the realm exhaled in relief and trepidation. The crown passed to her half-sister, Elizabeth Tudor, Elizabeth the first daughter of Anne Boleyn, and Henry VIII. With Elizabeth's accession, the pendulum of policy would swing yet again. She would initiate what the chroniclers would call the Elizabethan settlement, a framework of moderate Protestantism designed to placate both the old faith and the new. Under her reign, hymnals would once more replace Latin masses, but a spirit of tolerance, however measured, would allow both camps to find uneasy peace. Thus began the Elizabethan Restoration, an era of cultural flowering and relative stability. The Church of England, now solidly established, would preside over sermons in English, and the arts, poetry, drama, and music would bloom in tandem with flourishing trade and exploration. Yet throughout this golden age, the shadow of the 52-day prince lingered like a silent guardian of mortality. The memory of that fragile infant whose brief life had reshaped dynasties, haunted palace chambers and village churches alike. A constant reminder that peace and power rest upon a thread as slender as a newborn's breath. So, as Elizabeth led her people into an age of light and lyric, the quiet hush of that long-ago February morning remained ever present, a lullaby of sorrow woven into the very fabric of England's destiny. Elizabeth Tudor's reign, spanning from 1558 to 1603, ushered in an age of relative calm and flourishing prosperity for England. Ascending the throne after years of religious turbulence, she embraced what came to be known as the via media, or the middle way, a carefully calibrated policy that sought to harmonize the demands of both Catholics and Protestants. Her government reinstated the Book of Common Prayer in English, while allowing sufficient latitude for traditional ceremonies to placate those still attached to the old rites. This balanced approach helped to ease the nation's anxieties and fostered a renewed sense of unity. Under Elizabeth's patronage, the arts blossomed like flowers in spring. William Shakespeare penned sonnets and stage dramas that plumbed the depths of human emotion, while Christopher Marlowe's blank verse gave voice to ambitious heroes and tragic flaws. Sir Walter Raleigh's daring voyages ignited the public's imagination, and the prospect of new worlds beyond the horizon stirred both poets and merchants to dream grand dreams. The Queen herself kept a court brimming with music, masques, and eloquent discourse, so that every banquet and hunt doubled as a celebration of English culture. Maritime ventures received particular encouragement. Elizabeth granted charters to the newly formed East India Company, setting English ships upon the spice routes once dominated by Iberian powers. These voyages laid the groundwork for what would become the British Empire, with trading posts gradually dotting distant shores. Every triumphant return of a laden galleon, brimming with silks and spices, served as testament to England's growing ambition on the world stage. In the safety of her long reign, the Queen's rule came to symbolize a golden age of exploration and enterprise. Yet despite this brilliance, the darker legacies of Henry VIII's tumultuous rule could not simply be swept away. The sweeping dissolution of the monasteries had left an irreparable void in the cultural and charitable life of the realm. Monastic hospitals, which had once comforted the sick and wounded, lay abandoned or repurposed. Their libraries filled with centuries, old manuscripts had been dispersed or consumed by flames. Scores of learned monks and nuns, uprooted from the cloisters that had sustained them, found themselves adrift, many unable to adapt to a world that no longer valued their labour or learning. Moreover, England still bore the scars of Mary Tudor's reign, when hundreds perished for their Protestant faith. The shortage of experienced clergy, expelled or executed for refusing to conform, meant that some parishes struggled to find pastors fluent in both scripture and ceremony. In remote hamlets, worship sometimes recurred only when an itinerant preacher could be found, and even then, suspicion lingered. Though Elizabeth's government refrained from large-scale burnings, her spymasters kept careful watch on known recusants Catholics who remained loyal to the Pope and occasionally arranged for them to be deported or imprisoned. The uneasy truce that held the realm together was shattered on rare occasions by plots and assassinations. The execution of Mary, Queen of Scots, remains one of the era's most vivid reminders of the underlying tensions. Though Mary had sought refuge in England after fleeing Scottish rebels, Her presence was deemed an irresistible focus for Catholic intrigue. Conspiracies to free or replace Elizabeth swirled in the corridors of power, and in 1601, Mary's guilt in the Babington plot sealed her fate. Her beheading at Fotheringhay Castle reverberated across Europe, a grim illustration that Elizabeth's moderation had limits when her throne or her life was imperiled. Perhaps the most enduring testament to Henry VIII's authoritarian legacy was the very structure of governance Elizabeth inherited. Though she presided over parliaments that enacted statutes and granted taxes, the true engine of power lay with her alone. The Privy Council functioned at her pleasure, and even the House of Lords existed more to endorse her will than to challenge it. Elizabeth famously declared, "I am the state," embodying a concentrated sovereignty that her subjects could neither easily share nor oppose. In her presence, lords and bishops alike felt the weight of regal gaze, and every decision, from matters of war to questions of patronage, required her assent. Thus, the Elizabethan era, for all its accomplishments, could not entirely escape the tremors of past calamities. The formative shock of the 52-day-old prince's death had set England on a path of relentless change. Each succession crisis, whether under Edward VI, Mary I, or Elizabeth I, brought its own wave of religious and political recalibration. The via media that Elizabeth so deftly applied was itself a product of countless reversals and restorations, of fire and sword and broken vows. In the quiet moments of twilight, as the Queen retired to her chamber, the memory of that February morning in 1511 lingered like a soft lament. The empty cradle, long since dismantled and stored away, still cast a shadow in the corridors of history. It served as a reminder that the promise of stability is always tempered by the fragility of life, and that the crown, even when worn by a wise and patient monarch, rests upon a foundation both golden and brittle. As Elizabeth's final years greased the gears of a nascent empire, England moved forward with head held high, yet ever aware that power and peace are as fleeting as the breath of an infant, and that the echoes of a child's untaken steps can resonate through centuries. When Elizabeth I drew her final breath in 1603, the long and tumultuous line of the Tudors came to an end. Quietly, in the chambers of Whitehall, the Queen's hand fell at last, and with it the crown she had worn for nearly 45 years. In that stillness, the nation took a collective, trembling breath. Across the seas and rivers of England, the echoes of Elizabeth's passing rippled through market towns and great cities alike. The bells tolled, as they had tolled for her accession, but now their peals carried a different weight, a solemn lament for an age gone by, and an unwritten promise of what was to come under King James I of Scotland. Yet though the Tudors departed with Elizabeth, their legacy lingered like a ghost in the corridors of power. The absolute authority Henry VIII had seized the very act of breaking away from Rome, dissolving monasteries, and ordering arbitrary executions, had left indelible marks upon the nation's psyche. Those bold strokes of royal prerogative had set a precedent that would be felt long after the last Tudor king was laid to rest. The monasteries, once centres of learning and charity, lay in silent ruins, their stones repurposed into palaces and fortresses that bore testament to both human ingenuity and human sorrow. Westminster Abbey, where the tiny white coffin of the 52-day prince had been interred, remained a place of hushed reverence. Pilgrims and historians alike walked its aisles, pausing before the child's tomb, as if seeking to hear, in the soft whisper of stone, the echo of that breathless, unfinished life. In libraries and lecture halls, scholars continued to turn over the pages of two monstrous volumes, History and Tragedy. Historians wrote treatises examining how the death of a newborn prince could set in motion a revolution of faith, law, and monarchy. Novelists wove tales of courtly intrigue and broken vows, their protagonists haunted by the spectre of an heir who never lived to rule. Playwrights, some inspired by Shakespeare's own restless pen-staged dramas, in which the collapse of one life eclipsed the grandest designs of empire. Audiences sat in candlelit theatres, eyes heavy with both fascination and weariness, lulled by the knowledge that even the most powerful king could be brought low by the fragility of human flesh. Meanwhile, the very architecture of England bore witness to the Tudor saga. Hampton Court stood as a sprawling monument to Henry's unbridled ambition, its red brick walls a palimpsest of monastery foundations and royal expansions. Whitehall, too, showcased the Tudor taste for grandeur, its galleries and banqueting halls echoing with tales of feasts laid on by a king determined to dazzle his subjects. Windsor Castle, ancient yet augmented by successive monarchs, carried within its stone vaults the memory of every prince and princess who had walked its corridors. In each arch and turret, one could sense the mingling of hope and loss that had been the Tudor inheritance. On a broader stage, the Tudor dynasty had laid the groundwork for the England that would follow. The idea of a monarch subject to law, first chiselled out amid tumultuous disputes over church and state, would later develop into the principles of constitutional monarchy. The dissolution of the monasteries, though an act of destruction, spurred the rise of new charitable institutions and a secular approach to education, planting seeds that would bloom in the centuries to come. Even the bloody episodes of Mary's persecutions and Henry's capricious justice gave rise to a wariness of unchecked power, a lesson eventually enshrined in laws that limited the crown's reach. Yet the Tudor story also served as a warning. When personal grief and political ambition intertwine, the bonds of society can fray with astonishing speed. The death of the 52-day prince had been the spark that ignited wars of religion and roller-coaster successions. It had shown that the loss of one fragile life could set a mighty king on a path of relentless reform and ruthless reprisal. The dissolution of centuries of monastic tradition, the creation of a national church under royal control, and the executions of both queens and councillors, each action sprang from the same well of urgency, the desire to secure an unbroken male line. For every Tudor, king and queen, the memory of that infant's empty cradle served as both a motivator and a terror. Elizabeth, in her long and careful reign, balanced her authority with a measured tolerance precisely because she feared repeating the famines of leadership her forebears had endured. Her middle-way approach was as much a balm for national wounds as it was a shrewd political strategy. Yet even she could not entirely dispel the shadows cast by her brother's fragile life and her father's fierce obsession. As James I took the throne, uniting the crowns of England and Scotland, he did so under the gaze of those haunted memories. His rule would usher in its own controversies, plots and pamphlets, the gunpowder conspiracy, and the subsequent tightening of royal powers, but the undercurrent of the Tudor experience informed every decision. In James's relaxed carriage ride through London streets, one could glimpse a realm eager for stability but wary of the old extremes. In every debate at the Star Chamber or in the sermons at street pools, the lessons of the past lingered, that the alchemy of power, if unchecked by mercy, could transmute the strongest kingdom into ruins. And so, as the sun set on Elizabeth's era and rose again on James's, the nation carried forward both the promise and the perils of its Tudor heritage. The tomb of the 52-day prince closed a chapter of grief, yet the echo of his unbreathed breath continued to resonate through every statute and song, every stone and story. It reminded England that even the smallest voice can shape the destinies of empires and that power, however dazzling, must always be tempered by humanity's fragile pulse. In that quiet lesson lay a lullaby for the ages, that history's deepest truths often whisper through the softest sighs. When Elizabeth I breathed her last in 1603, the nearly century and a half of Tudor rule came gently to a close. In the stillness that followed her passing, courtiers and commoners alike felt the weight of an era drawing its final breath. Yet in that very moment, as one dynasty faded, another stepped forward without contest or election, like a tide rushing in to fill the hush of a receding wave. James I of Scotland. James VI ascended the English throne, uniting crowns that had been divided by blood and rebellion. His accession by hereditary right, rather than by any vote or coup, was itself a testament to the long, tumultuous journey of succession that the Tudors had forged and fractured before him. The notion of automatic inheritance, firstborn son succeeding his father daughters, permitted rule only in the absence of a male heir, had taken form under Henry VIII's own tumultuous reign. When Catherine of Aragon gave only a princess named Mary, her union was dissolved. When Anne Boleyn produced Elizabeth, her head joined the executioner's block. Only when Jane Seymour delivered a son named Edward did the dynasty seem secure, until Edward's fragile life proved otherwise. And when Mary restored papal power, only to be succeeded by Elizabeth's via media, the fragile equilibrium between the law of lineal descent and the king's personal prerogative revealed itself as a razor's edge. In Scotland and England alike, Sovereigns and subjects marveled at the Tudor precedent. A single lineage binding two realms, its strength both awe-inspiring and precarious. Yet the Tudor experiments in marriage and annulment left a legacy equally profound in the realm of law. Henry's 6 marriages, specifically his first 4 unions, each intended to produce a male heir, broke new ground in legal authority. Where once only the Pope could dissolve a sacrament, the king now claimed that power for himself. The act of supremacy enthroned him as head of both church and state, and the royal courts took on spiritual jurisdiction that had once belonged to Rome. Thus was born the Anglican Church, an institution neither fully Protestant nor wholly Catholic, but a hybrid bearing the hallmarks of sovereign command. This melding of spiritual and temporal power laid the groundwork for the Church of England, which over the ensuing centuries would become a defining feature of national identity. On the world stage, England's rupture with Rome also reconfigured diplomatic alignments. The closed doors of papal favour put England at odds with staunchly Catholic powers, such as Spain and France, which once regarded her as a natural ally through Queen Catherine's Spanish lineage. Yet this severance freed English ambitions to seek fortunes beyond continental confines. The nascent Royal Navy, proclaimed on the waves of Henry's maritime reforms and Elizabeth's encouragement, grew into a might that would challenge Spanish galleons and carve trade routes to far-off lands. By the 17th and 18th centuries, those routes would become the sinews of a global empire. But the seed of that expansion had been sown in the turmoil of a church and a crown at odds. At home, however, the dissolution of monastic holdings left a void in charitable and educational life. Monks and nuns who had tended both body and mind were cast aside, their libraries dispersed or burned. In their place, new grammar schools and parish charities struggled to fill the gap. Universities such as Oxford and Cambridge absorbed stray manuscripts, yet the intimate scholarship of cloistered life could never be fully recovered. England, now lacking the vast network of monastic learning and almsgiving, turned to humanist scholars and emerging scientific thinkers to preserve and eventually advance the knowledge once safeguarded behind abbey walls. Through all this, the image of the 52-day-old Prince Henry Tudor, Duke of Cornwall, remained the silent catalyst of these grand transformations. His brief life and untimely death had set in motion a chain reaction of grief and ambition, of legal precedents and religious wars, of architectural marvels and colonial dreams. Whenever the Tudors were invoked, so too was the spectre of that tiny, pale child, swaddled in silk and laid to rest beneath Westminster's vaulted ceilings. His cradle, long since dismantled and stored in some forgotten chamber, had become an emblem of the fragile link between personal loss and political upheaval. Thus, when future monarchs and ministers spoke of securing the dynasty, they did so in the shadow of that silent prince. They remembered that even the mightiest crown rested upon a single heir's breath, and that the loss of one small life could steer the course of nations. The Tudor story, its glitter and its gore, stood as a lasting reminder that power, untempered by compassion, can rend the very soul of a realm. And so, as England moved into the Stuart age and beyond, it carried with it the echo of a newborn's cry, the whisper of a reign born in tragedy, and the knowledge that the smallest hands may guide the greatest destinies. Under the Tudor dynasty, and most notably during the reign of Henry VIII, England's skyline was transformed by a profusion of grand architectural statements, each structure a testament to royal ambition and personal taste. Hampton Court Palace, originally a modest manor held by Cardinal Wolsey, was expanded in a flourish of Baroque wings that swept along the banks of the Thames like the folds of a royal cloak. Its vast kitchens rang with the clatter of copper pots, and its long tiled galleries echoed with the footsteps of ambassadors from far-flung courts. Every carved chimney and mullioned window stood as an assertion of English sovereignty and regal magnificence. Whitehall Palace, too, took shape under Henry's direction, evolving into a majestic reception house for foreign envoys and domestic nobility. Its grand halls, draped in tapestries depicting Tudor triumphs, resonated with the sound of lutes and viols. State banquets were held beneath lofty ceilings, hung with heraldic banners that proclaimed the Tudor lineage in crimson and gold. Every architectural detail, from the intricately wrought ironwork on the gates to the polished marble of its fireplaces, was designed to impress upon any guest the might and refinement of the English crown. Meanwhile, Windsor Castle, long a royal retreat, underwent a renaissance of its own. Medieval battlements were softened by the graceful proportions of Renaissance design, as courtyards were paved with stone in geometric patterns and windows were refashioned into elegant grid-jointed frames. The round tower rose higher, its silhouette visible for miles, a sentinel over the rolling Berkshire countryside. Here, Henry entertained foreign dignitaries and staged hunts that blended courtly pageantry with martial prowess, the castle's stones themselves whispering of a dynasty's ambition to endure beyond any mortal life. Alongside these architectural marvels, the Tudor court saw an efflorescence of artistic creativity that mirrored the kingdom's political grandeur. Hans Holbein the Younger, court painter to Henry VIII, captured the regal bearing of his sitters in portraits of startling realism. His brush immortalized noble faces set against rich brocades, their expressions unreadable, yet brimming with the weight of power. Sculptors carved wooden reliefs and statues in oak and alabaster, their delicate details preserving the likenesses of royalty and the heraldic beasts that flanked them. Music, too, found a royal home in Tudor England. The court's musicians, a retinue of lutanists, virginal players, and recorder virtuosos filled the halls with harmonies both ornate and gentle. New forms of composition, inspired by Italian madrigals and continental motets, took root on English soil. The posset flute, with its soft, breathy timbre, became a favourite for intimate gatherings, while the stately rhythm of viol consorts provided the soundtrack for grand ceremonies. In tiltyards and banquet chambers alike, music underscored every gesture, setting hearts to beat in time with the crown's slow, deliberate cadence. Even as monastic life was forcibly dissolved, the spirit of learning carried on through reinvention. Displaced monks and nuns, scholars whose cloistered scriptoria had once copied centuries-old manuscripts, turned their attention to new foundations. They helped establish grammar schools in market towns and reading rooms in parish churches. Many of the precious volumes rescued from suppressed abbeys found their way to the libraries of Oxford and Cambridge, where they joined classical texts from Italy and Greece brought by exiled humanists. Thus the seeds of the English Renaissance were sown, as Greek lexicons and Platonist treatises mingled with medieval commentaries in candlelit halls of learning. Under the absolute authority wielded by the king, artistic patronage often became a contest between creative freedom and courtly command. Courtier artists found themselves negotiating the boundaries of innovation and orthodoxy. A tapestry design might glorify the monarch's martial victories while conforming to heraldic regulations. A new musical setting could carry subtle religious messages, so long as it did not challenge royal supremacy. Yet this very tension produced a distinctive Tudor style, evident in the steeply pitched roofs, the diamond-pane windows set in sturdy timber frames, and the carved stone pillars bearing Tudor roses and angelic figures. Centuries later, these motifs would be revived in country houses and municipal buildings, testifying to the enduring resonance of Tudor aesthetics. Long after the last Tudor monarch passed into history, their cultural legacy continued to stir the imagination. In the 21st century, enthusiasts don velvet doublets and farthingales for Tudor-style pageants and masquerades. Madrigal choirs gather in village churches to revive the polyphonic splendours first heard in Hampton Court's gallery, their voices rising in a delicate tapestry of sound. Historical reenactors tilt at lances in recreated tournaments on city greens, giving new life to the rituals once staged before Henry's peers and foreign emissaries. These living traditions remind us that the Tudor age was more than a chapter of dynastic drama. It was a crucible in which architecture, art, music, and ceremony were fused into a potent expression of national identity. They testify to the vitality of a realm that, despite the tragedies of palace intrigue and the horrors of religious persecution, found in its own creative spirit a means to transcend its darkest moments. Even as the ghost of the 52-day-old prince lingered in the shadows, an eternal witness to the price of power, England discovered in its courts and cloisters a source of beauty and intellectual vigour that would ripple across centuries. So, when the festive torches light up a Tudor banquet reenactment today, or when madrigals drift through a modern concert hall, they carry within them the echo of those same human aspirations and anxieties that shaped that long-ago age. And as swords clash once more on the grassy tiltyard, one can almost feel the pulse of history beneath that gentle rhythm, the heartbeat of a dynasty at once majestic and fragile. In every stone, every strain of song, every brushstroke and carved cornice, the Tudor legacy endures, a testament to how splendour and sorrow, art and authority, conspire to create a world that, even in its lament, remains achingly, beautifully alive. When the tiny life of his 52-day-old son slipped away, Henry VIII felt the first tremor of doubt shake the foundations of his power. Once a young monarch brimming with confidence, his heart aflame for grand tournaments and martial triumph, he now lingered in silent corridors, haunted by the memory of that fragile prince. The collapse of that single tiny breath became the fulcrum upon which his world turned. Grief gave way to self-absorption, and a new, relentless drive to secure his lineage took hold. No longer content simply to wield the sword in ceremonial displays, Henry began to wield his authority with grim determination, stamping his personal will onto every corner of the realm. Psychologically, the death of his heir plunged Henry into a state of endless fear that the Tudor claim might shatter like a brittle pane of glass. Each whisper of discontent in court, each sigh of dissent among the people, seemed to him a harbinger of civil war's bloody returns. He cast about for methods of control, turning first to law, then to force. Where once he had practiced a measure of tolerance toward Catholic courtiers, he now pressed harsh punishments upon any who questioned his supremacy. Spies reported on private conversations. Servants kept watch on the priest's sermons, and a network of informants wove through the taverns and markets, carrying tidings both trivial and troubling back to the king's ear. In this climate of fear, the shadow of tragedy provided a convenient pretext to consolidate royal power. Henry invoked the prince's death to justify four annulments: the execution of Anne Boleyn and the dissolution of monastic orders. Monasteries, centuries-old havens of learning and charity, fell one by one beneath the royal hammer, their lands and treasures redirected to the crown. The king's subjects came to understand. Any institution that might look to a higher authority than Henry would be demolished in short order. By these acts, Henry did more than secure his household. He laid the stones for a monarchy unbound by tradition. In the certainty of his own decrees, he found solace, even as the echoes of that lost child's silent cries reverberated through each empty cloister. Yet Henry's apparent self-assurance was always born of terror. Beneath the lavish velvet and polished armor lay a heart perpetually rent by loss. As his life wore on, disease and injury sapped his once formidable strength. His hunting boots grew heavy, his gait slowed to a cumbersome shuffle, his knees weakened, his legs ulcerated, and years of gout made each step a trial. The great minstrel hall that once echoed to his laughter now witnessed a king leaning upon the arms of courtiers, his once upright shoulders stooped in fatigue. He became dependent on advisers who fed his anxieties, even as they jockeyed for influence. Still, for all his infirmity, Henry never relinquished the tenor of command. Even from his heavy-footed chair, he issued edicts, condemning critics and crafting new statutes to expand his prerogative. His counselors, fearful for their lives and fortunes, learned to anticipate his moods, framing every report in terms that flattered the king's wounded pride. In the damp silence of his private chambers, Henry would stare at portraits of his vanished child and murmur, as though seeking an answer only the prince could provide. Yet there was no balm to ease his sorrow, no rival to his dominion, save the relentless passage of time. Thus the last years of Henry VIII stand as a study in tragic paradox. A man whose youthful vigour and magnanimous spirit had once kindled a realm now found himself shackled by his own grief. The power he claimed to protect his dynasty ended up transforming him into the very tyrant he once despised. His empty cradle, dismantled and stored away, became a ghostly symbol of how fragile lineage can drive the strongest heart to callousness. And as the king aged, his monstrous girth and afflicted limbs served as a living monument to the price exacted when absolute authority entwines with personal tragedy. In the hollow echo of his footsteps, one hears the lament of a once great sovereign, undone by the tenderest breath of all. Tudor history offers us a somber parable. Even the greatest power remains subject to the frailty of human lives, our beliefs, our fears, and the smallest of breaths. The brief life and untimely death of the 52-day-old Prince Henry Tudor crystallized this truth. In his personal grief, Henry VIII reshaped the religious and political landscape of an entire nation. One infant's passing set into motion the severing of ties with Rome, the dissolution of centuries-old monasteries, and the redefinition of sovereign authority. From that fragile beginning, policies rippled outward, altering the very order of the world. Reflecting upon these events today, we recognize the critical balance between power and humanity. When too much weight is placed upon the shoulders of the next generation, be they children, protégés, or any entrusted successor, the resulting pressure can exceed their capacity to bear it. The emotional toll may fracture not only an individual's spirit, but also the social bonds that hold communities together. In places and moments where leadership demands certainty above all, we see the risk of forgetting that those who follow us are, at their core, human too. Moreover, the Tudor era reminds us of the limitations inherent in medical knowledge of any age. The treatments administered to the young prince bleeding to rebalance humours, incantations to ward off evil, or powdered pearls, thought to confer health, originated from a mixture of emerging science and deep-rooted superstition. Though such remedies once offered hope, they often inflicted more harm than healing. In our own time, despite the marvels of modern medicine, we must remain vigilant against the misuse of treatments or the blind faith in miracle cures. History instructs us that no remedy, however promising, is free from risk, and that critical inquiry must temper all hope. The Tudors also demonstrate the intricate, often perilous, interplay between religion and politics. Henry VIII's break with the Catholic Church, Mary Tudor's vengeful reintegration of papal authority, and Elizabeth I's via media, all reflected shifting alliances and doctrinal demands. Each pivot offered hope for unity, only to usher in new cycles of repression and resentment. When religion becomes a tool of statecraft, social cohesion falters under the weight of alternating zealotry and tolerance. In a world still beset by sectarian strife, the Tudor experience stands as a cautionary tale. Political advantage may be gained by invoking faith, but the resulting societal fractures can endure for generations. Finally, the enduring image of the 52-day-old prince serves as a potent symbol for the profound connection between the smallest lives and the highest seats of power. It reminds us that policy, war, and the grand constructions of empires all trace back to the human heart, its hopes, its fears, its losses. In moments of crisis, when leaders feel compelled to wield absolute authority, a child's vulnerability can become both the justification and the judgment upon their actions. May we carry forward these lessons from Tudor history, that strength untempered by compassion may lead to tyranny, that the sanctity of human life, no matter how brief, should guide our laws and our hearts, and that in the quietest moments when a ruler mourns a child, they might remember that their own power, too, is as fragile as the breath of an infant. Now, let your mind drift gently, each breath a soft wave that rises and falls in quiet rhythm. Imagine once more that frosted February morning of 1511, when the empty cradle lay pale and silent beside a window veiled in mist. The air was so cold it whispered through the shutters like a secret, and even the birds had not yet dared to greet the dawn. A single candle flickered in the nursery, its flame trembling with every breath of winter, as if it too sensed the fragile hush enveloping those gilded walls. In this peaceful moment, allow the sweeping tapestry of Tudor history to dissolve into a gentle memory, its grand castles, its soaring cathedrals, and its fierce intrigues all receding like a soft fog at sunrise. What remains is the quiet lesson carried by that tiny life, that even the greatest empires, built on towering pillars of stone and law, are shaped by the most delicate of hearts. We learn that power, without compassion to guide it, can crumble as easily as the ice that coats the mourning world. We learn that grief can stir the currents of change, steering the course of nations in ways both wondrous and sorrowful. As you breathe in this sense of calm, notice how your shoulders soften, how the tension in your chest eases, and how the boundaries between waking and dreaming begin to blur. The distant toll of imagined church bells drifts on the air, growing fainter with each passing moment. There is no need to cling to the grand drama of kings and queens. Now let those stories rest in the pages of history, while you sink deeper into the warmth of your own quiet space. Remember the true gift of this tale, that in the end, it is not the monuments of stone or the weight of crowns that define our legacy, but the gentle kindness we show to one another, the empathy we bear for every small soul, and the tender moments we share beneath the same vast sky. Even the smallest breath, like that of the Tudor prince, can leave echoes that resonate down the ages, so let your own kindness ripple outward, touching those around you in ways both subtle and profound. Now, as the candle in that dreamlike nursery guttered to its last glow, imagine its light fading softly into darkness, leaving only the faintest afterimage of warmth. Feel yourself cocooned in the soft embrace of blankets, each thread woven from the quiet courage that comes when we face our fears and choose compassion instead. Allow your eyelids to grow heavy, your thoughts drifting like wisps of cloud across a pale winter sky. And in that gentle half-light between wakefulness and sleep, know that you are safe, that the world holds its breath with you, and that tomorrow's dawn will bring new hopes, kindled by the memories we carry softly in our hearts. Thank you for sharing this quiet journey through history's tenderest moments. If you find comfort in these whispered tales, please subscribe to our channel so that more gentle stories may find their way to you, inviting restful dreams and peaceful nights. Good night, and may your sleep be as serene as that misty February morn, cradling you in warmth until the morning light. Sleep well,